All right, welcome to Iowa Ideas Session 2 for Energy and Environment Water Quality Session. I'm your room host, Stephen Colbert. I'll be monitoring the chat for any questions and keeping the moderators looped in. Everyone is on mute, but I'll be checking the chat in Huva for any questions to make sure everyone is looped in. The moderator for today's panel is Gazette opinion editor, Todd Dorman. Todd, have at it.
Thanks, Stephen. So this is the water quality panel, as Stephen said. We've got Scott Nelson, who's the Director of Agronomy for the Iowa Soybean Association's Research Center for Farming Innovation. And we also have William O'Brien, who's the Water Resource Recovery Manager for the City of Dubuque. And Chris Jones, who's a research engineer at IIHR, Hydroscience and Engineering at the University of Iowa. So I'm going to give each of you panelists just a few minutes to talk about what you do and how your work relates to the water quality subject at hand. I guess, Scott, we could start with you.
Okay, well, like he said, my name is Scott Nelson, and I work very closely with farmers on how to improve production in soil health and water quality management systems. And from my perspective, the future is bright for getting farmers to implement better water quality and soil health systems. I was with a farmer yesterday and he said, you know, I've always been interested in cover crops. And so we set it up and we're doing a trial location with him where he's going to split a field with cover crops with and without. And then I'll be able to give him technical guidance on the best steps to go through for managing that cover crops. Now, cover crop systems don't have to be more complicated than traditional systems, but they do need some technical assistance. And so in that situation, we see this is an ideal situation where we can coach a farmer who's just beginning to work him through the do's and don'ts of managing cover crops. And that's opposed to a system where a farmer reads a magazine and tries cover crops and doesn't have any technical assistance and has a failure. So anyway, that's two ways of looking at it.
Okay. William, you want to go next?
Yes, as Todd said, I'm William O'Brien. I'm the plant manager for the City of Dubuque Water and Resource Recovery Center. I've been with the city and the department since 2007. Started as an intern here and worked my way up to plant manager, which I became in 2016. In the city of Dubuque, sustainability is one of our major goals. And back in 2006 and ever since, the mayor and city council identified that becoming a more sustainable city was one of the top priorities for our community. We have a climate action plan that was updated here in 2020 that includes reducing wastewater impacts and mitigating flood hazards and the impacts from that. We really pride ourselves on partnerships that we've built with our county, with other local communities, with the state, and also on leveraging local, state, and federal funding. So we've got a number of water quality initiatives going on in the city of Dubuque, whether it's in our wastewater utility, working on nutrient reduction and the nutrient reduction exchange. We were the first in the state to sign a memorandum of understanding with the Iowa Department of Natural Resources that allows us to work out in the watershed to install, working with other partners, install these water quality improvement projects, and then be able to take the nutrient reductions for that and apply them toward our meeting the goals of our the nutrient reduction goals in our NPDES permit. On the stormwater side, we have our B branch watershed flood mitigation project that has with a major goal of daylighting this B branch creek and mitigating or reducing flooding in a large area of our city. We're involved in several sponsored projects. We borrowed a lot of money for projects from the state revolving fund. And I believe we had the first SRF sponsored project. After we upgraded our wastewater facility, which was about a $70 million project, we were able to take about $9.4 million in sponsored project money and construct 70 green alleys around the city. So we've got a lot of different things going on, which I'd be happy to expand on more. Thank you.
Okay. Chris?
So yes, my name's Chris Jones. I work at the University of Iowa at the IIHR Institute. My job is to coordinate the university's network of water quality sensors that are deployed around the state of Iowa. And this is linked up to our water quality information system. So the average person can go to our website and see what water quality is in real time at all these places around Iowa. And I also have my own research program. I work closely with Keith Schilling, who's the state geologist and the head of the Iowa Geological Survey, and our work focuses on contaminant hydrology in agricultural watersheds. And so we're looking at nutrient transport, sediment, microorganisms like E. coli and some other things. We also do some work on the fringes of flooding and climate. Keith and I think everybody's heard of the Iowa Flood Center. It's part of IIHR, and so we work closely with the staff over there. And I would say our staff has been involved in these projects in Dubuque that you just heard mentioned, the Bee Branch and project, and then also the Catfish Creek project up there in Dubuque. So that's what I do.
Okay, Chris, I'm going to stick with you. The water quality problem in Iowa, as it's generally understood, is that we have nitrogen and phosphorus running into waterways, mostly from cropland, sometimes through tiles, sometimes off the land. And those, you know, those nutrients cause problems on our waterways here in the state, and also flow down to the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico. So based on what you've been, on the data you've been reviewing, are we making progress on either phosphorus or nitrates? And there's been, you know, the dead zone was smaller this year, and some people have said, hey, that's a sign of progress. What are you seeing?
Well, for nitrogen, we clearly are not improving, and I think there's, you know, a consensus on that the levels of nitrogen in our streams are increasing. And, you know, there's really no reason for us to expect any differently for that, because we continue to see an expansion of the tile drainage system, which we know is the primary delivery mechanism for nitrate to our streams. We see an expansion of the livestock industry without a concomitant decrease in commercial fertilizer. So we continue to increase the amount of manure we produce, but we don't decrease the amount of commercial fertilizer that we use. And so, you know, there's no reason to believe that nitrogen should be going down in our streams. Yes, we do have some practices going on the ground. As Scott said there, we have cover crops, and depending on, you know, your source of data, maybe anywhere from 3 to 6% of Iowa cropland has cover crops on it, you know, 7, 8 years after the nutrient strategy's been implemented. And so, you know, we don't have a decline in conservation, I wouldn't think, although, you know, cover crops might increase and decrease a little bit from year to year. But so, yeah, that's a story for nitrogen. For phosphorus, it's a little cloudier. The data that we've looked at over here would indicate that phosphorus has marginally increased over the last 20 years since 2000, maybe by about 10%. There's some other modeling that's been done at Iowa State that would imply that phosphorus has decreased some. And so the situation is better, or at least not as bad for phosphorus And so it's a little easier for us to tackle the phosphorus problem since it's so connected to soil erosion. And so when we reduce soil erosion, we also reduce phosphorus transport. And so that in a nutshell is what we see.
You wrote an essay or a blog post or whatever you like to call it recently about something that sort of encapsulates kind of the situation in Iowa. You talked about Bloody Run Creek in Clayton County. I wonder if you could give us a kind of a synopsis of what occurred there.
So Bloody Run Creek is one of what we call 34 outstanding Iowa waters, designated by DNR because it remains in a fairly undisturbed condition. And so it's a trout stream. It's both stocked and has reproduction, natural reproduction of trout. It's a small watershed, and a 10,000 or 11,600 head cattle feedlot, wants to set up shop in the watershed that's, in total area smaller than the city of Des Moines. And so, is this system that we have for siting and permitting these livestock operations consistent with our water quality objectives? And so, the point of that and the other things, some other things that I've written is that no, it isn't. Why do we let this sort of thing happen here in Iowa when we have so few waters that are in a good condition? And so this is something we really can't get our head around. It's not any one thing that farmers are doing, that causes our degraded water. It's the scale at which we're doing things. And, until we come to grips with that, I just think, we're going to be sitting here like we are today, trying to, dredge up some good news stories that imply that there's progress in improving water quality. And, that's where we're at.
Okay. William, with your, you've got this first in the state agreement with the DNR. How much success have you had finding upstream, landowners in the watershed that are willing to do, conservation projects? And is it a situation where you're paying entirely for the projects, or do farmers also make an investment?
So we've worked, collaborated with the Catfish Creek Watershed Management Authority on this project, which has a program for cover crops. We've got a number of landowners up in the watershed to take part in that program. And I think, from what we're seeing, the farmers are starting to see the value of that. Some of them have continued to use cover crops, even if there wasn't funding available. But I think we're definitely seeing that program expand. There are a number of other water quality improvements that the Catfish Creek, along with the city, have constructed. Some stream bank restoration, actually corridor restoration. There's the Catfish Creek has a soil quality restoration program that's been used quite a bit. As far as the cover crops, I think we're seeing that expand, and people are seeing the value in that.
Oh, sorry, I'm still, I knew I'd do that. Scott, we've got this voluntary system where, it's up to farmers to decide whether they adopt conservation practices. I've heard Secretary Mike Negg say it's voluntary but not optional, which I'm not 100% sure what that means, but it's an interesting way to frame it. Based on your experience, what needs to happen to convince more farmers to adopt these practices that control the runoff?
Well, I'll tell you a story. I was in a meeting up in Spencer, Iowa last winter, and we just, I was a little scared to present the data, but I put the data in front of them about how much nitrates we're losing in the groundwater going into the stream water, and that's eventually ending up in the Mississippi. And I put it in terms of rail cars of granular urea. That's, I calculated the amount of nitrate into rail cars of urea. And I've seen the farmers thank me, and they said, that's my responsibility. And, nitrogen, and several of those began, these were primarily livestock operations, and they wanted to do work with cover crops and integrate that into their system. And so I think if we can, I think there's tremendous potential if we just put the facts in front of farmers calmly about what we're losing, and we put it in a way that they can understand, that we'll see a greater adoption. Or certainly we won't get all of them, but we will get a greater adoption to the extent that we just communicate effectively to them about the problems that we're facing and why.
When you meet with some resistance, what is the resistance usually about?
Well, it's primarily farmers that have had bad experiences in soil health promoting systems with cover crops or no-till. They say that their cash crop yield decreased, and they didn't understand that that the management doesn't need to be more complicated, but it does need to be different. And nobody's, to the extent we haven't really, through extension and through agronomic teaching, we haven't really laid out for farmers how a soil health promoting or a water quality system must be different, and that you can still realize very profitable cash crop yields in a soil health promoting system. It just needs to be different.
Okay. William, you're running a water plant, which has a much different experience than a farm, because you're regulated. You're required to reduce, these nutrients that are going into your water supply or your drinking water. So you said that you're getting credits against that based on what sort of reductions you get in the watershed. Has that, I guess tell us first about what you're required to do, and also whether this has started to, I guess, reduce your liability there for pollutants.
Sure. If I go back to 2010, we started the construction for our current facility. We had a major overhaul. It was the largest capital improvement project the city had taken on up to that point. Construction of our facility was completed in around 2013. Our NPDES permit in 2013 was our first permit cycle to include a requirement to study what it would take to reduce nitrogen by 66% and phosphorus by 75%. We were to submit a feasibility study, essentially, to the Iowa Department of Natural Resources by September of 2015, which we did. At that time, we said that it was feasible, but it was not financially reasonable for us to do that. We had taken on a lot of debt in the upgrade of our plant. And so I believe it was around January of 2017, our permit was amended and then required us to perform another study or an update to the original study to be submitted by January 1st of 22. So we've just started that second round study. And in this time, we'll actually be looking at the watershed, what potential there is out in the watershed for nutrient reductions. So that we'll be looking at facility improvements and combined with these watershed improvements to get to that goal of 66% and 75% reduction. Through our memorandum of understanding, we will be able to take some of those reductions in the watershed, put them toward the goals of our permit. We could just look at making improvements to our facility alone. But I think we have a lot of opportunity here to work with our partners to be a catalyst out in the watershed, to work with landowners. And if we're able to reduce, the nutrients to the amount of our requirements, they will have so many other benefits that come along with that, as far as erosion control, flood mitigation, creating habitat. So I guess that's where we're at right now. We're in the midst of our study here and hope to be able to find the best path forward for the city, be able to cost effectively meet the goals or the limits in our permit, but also to try to create more benefits rather than just the nutrient reductions here at our facility.
What's your source of drinking water there?
Groundwater.
Groundwater. And when you're talking about reducing nitrates, that's the nitrates you're taking out of the water, and then you put them back in, after they're removed. Is that what the discharge would be?
So our permit requires us to reduce the amount of, so this is the wastewater facility.
Oh, okay. Okay. Yeah, I just wondered with drinking water, because I know during the saga with the Des Moines Water Works, they talked about how they removed a lot of nitrate, but then had to re-dump it into the river after it was removed from the drinking water. So I wondered if that was part of what you were talking about.
Oh, okay. No,
yeah.
It would be on the wastewater side alone.
Sure. Okay. So Chris, I was going to ask you, it sounds like the governor is going to come back with her sales tax plan in the next legislative session, which would include some money for water quality, although it seemed like her plan during the past session replaced a lot of existing funding with new dollars. So I'm not sure how much it moved the funding upward. The Senate passed a bill a couple of years ago to increase funding over a 10 or 12 year period. If you could run the legislature for a day, what do you think the solution is, or what do you think the best thing that they could do as far as public policy would be to address these issues?
So we have this huge system, right? And almost all of our land is working land. We have almost, no public land here to work with. And so in a lot of other states, you have flexibility to, do some things on public lands. Here we don't have that. And so people ask me all the time, what can be done? How can we move the needle, so to speak? And there are some things we could do, I think, that would produce some pretty immediate and, measurable effects, and they wouldn't be that hard. And so the first thing to do would be to get farmers out of the 2-year floodplain. We've got 300,000 acres in Iowa that are farmed in the 2-year floodplain. Why are we doing that with commodity prices, being what they are? It's perverse. Every 2 years, all the inputs on that land, gone to the Gulf of Mexico. It makes no sense. So could we get farmers out of the floodplains? That would be one. Second, we could ban fall tillage. We've known for 40 or 50 years that fall tillage is terrible, especially after soybean. We know it contributes to nutrient loss, both phosphorus and nitrogen. We know it's almost never necessary. Get rid of it. Ban fall tillage. Thirdly, we could try to get our handle around this livestock issue. I mean, it just, it's illogical to think that we can continue to cram livestock into some of these watersheds and expect good water quality. It's counterintuitive. The Floyd River watershed, Northwest Iowa, I don't know, I think it's 886 square miles. We've got upwards of 800 or 900 permitted confinements there. So we've got a permitted confinement on every section. Is that ever going to be consistent with any sort of reasonable water quality in the Floyd River? I mean, you just can't say that it is. And so, we've got to be able to manage nutrients at the watershed scale. We are not going to solve this, especially with nitrogen, until we're able to do that. And one way to do it is to, again, try to get some logic behind this siding of livestock. So all of that takes political will, right? I mean, it takes laws, and we have no, courage to do any of that stuff. I mean, let's just face it, the industry wants a license to do whatever they want to do. And thus far, they've basically gotten it. This is America. We all want these voluntary things to work, right? Nobody wants to be coerced into doing something on their land or in their business. But if we're going to have a voluntary system, we need volunteers. And we just had this project, the Housing and Urban Development money, the Iowa Watershed Approach Project. We had $2.5 million, the Flood Center did, to try to implement practices in the North Raccoon, the highest profile watershed in the state. And all they could get done up there was a watershed plan that half the stakeholders hated. And so, we couldn't even get one project on the ground, $2 million. Nobody would take it. So what is the solution here? I don't have it, but, we've got to try to do something different.
When you talk about the 2-year floodplain, does that, I know Minnesota has done the buffer strip requirement. Does that need to be part of it? Is that, even if you get out of that 2-year floodplain, is there anything else that has to happen?
So what I mean by that is that, they're not cropping the 2-year floodplain.
Right.
I'm not asking them to, cede their land to the state. Just don't be planting row crops there. That's what I mean by farmed. In Minnesota, they have the 50-foot buffer requirement that, all perennial streams have to be buffered for 50 feet on each side. The conservation districts of Iowa proposed a 30-foot buffer here for Iowa, and it was approved and then sent on to IDALS, and IDALS basically killed it. And so, these very simple, common sense things that we know for a certainty would work, we can't get them done. And, I don't know what more to say about it.
Todd, if I could just chime in.
Yeah, go ahead.
It's easy for us that live water quality every day to assume, well, everybody understands the issues and all that. When I talk to farmers, they don't quite understand it, and the average farmer doesn't, they don't live in water quality and they don't understand the issues, and so it's hard to ask them to be volunteers when they don't understand that there's a problem. And to the extent that I think before we start talking about regulations, I feel like we need more a better emphasis on better communication to farmers in ways that are being them on the issue, and that involves getting industry involved, getting agronomists involved, and all of us singing the same hymn book about the issues. And from my experience, I think you would see a great change in voluntary responses if we were able to communicate more effectively.
Scott, the Soybean Association has been probably more out front on these issues than the other commodity groups. Are you seeing other entities, other commodity groups, or others that are doing that education, or who's doing it now?
Well, the problem is you have to think about who do farmers listen to, and their most trusted advisors are the people that they put the most emphasis on when they make management decisions is their agronomist, their retail agronomist, their seed agronomist. Maybe they have a private consultant. And we're just beginning to get into that realm where we're doing hiring conservation agronomists to work with retailers and train the commercial agronomists in aspects of soil, water, and soil and water management. And I think to the extent that we can reach the certified crop advisors, that we're going to reach a lot of farmers, because those are the ones that they look to for advice. And to the extent that we can get them on our side, then we'll make huge progress.
I did get one question, I think that maybe for you, Scott, from a viewer. What is your calculation on the rail car loads and tons of urea equivalent of going into the Mississippi from Iowa?
Yeah, now my calculation is from a Basso paper, and I'm sure Chris et al. Are very familiar with it, but for the 6 states surrounding the Mississippi, I calculated his nitrogen losses as 18,000 rail cars of fertilizer dumped into the Mississippi every year. And that's 200,000 pound rail cars. Now that data is somewhat disputed by some university people, but from that paper, that's what the estimate was 18,000 rail cars of fertilizer dumped into the Mississippi every year.
Okay, thanks. Hopefully that answers the question. So Chris, I mean, do you agree with Scott that this is an education situation as much as it is policy?
Well, I agree. It's a factor. I would have 2 responses to that. One is, how long are we supposed to wait? And 2, in terms of the CCAs and the other people working retail, I mean, let's face it, they want to sell product, right? If you're working on commission selling a product to a farmer, do you want to sell less? I mean, I wouldn't. We're all human beings, right? And so when incomes are linked, livelihoods are linked to what these farmers are doing, there's a very powerful force that maintains the status quo. That's why we haven't seen any progress. We have all these livelihoods, not just farmers, thousands of other people whose livelihoods are connected to what these farmers are doing. And, they don't necessarily want change. And so I don't know. I think, after the Waterworks lawsuit, could there be anybody in Iowa that doesn't understand this, at least on some level? I guess I wonder.
William, you work in an urban setting. Do you get a sense that your customers in Dubuque think about water quality or concerned about this issue, or what do you hear?
I think there definitely is concern. I mean, on average, with the average citizen, do they have major concerns? I'm not sure. I think we're trying to do a good job promoting awareness of water quality issues. And we've been collaborating with Dubuque County, with other communities in the area. Part of our, I'll back up, the city of Dubuque has a MS4 stormwater permit. I think it was first permitted in 2004, and as part of that, educational outreach is a requirement. So we have been talking to the community about water quality issues. We worked with the Catfish Creek Watershed to go out and talk to entities, to landowners outside the city. So we're trying to promote awareness of the water quality issues. And I think, to a certain portion of the citizens, it is important. To others, it may not be as important, but to the city of Dubuque, it is one of our goals to improve our water quality and improve the environment and just the general living standards for our citizens. And I feel like we're seeing some success. We just signed a 28E agreement with the Dubuque County and the Dubuque Soil and Water Conservation District, which the district is actually going to be doing some work that the city, or we're going to contract with the district for stormwater inspections and some of the other things that are required under our MS4 permit. But in addition to that, this 28E agreement, it kind of reaches throughout the county to address things in the city and outside of the city. So I think through our agreement with these other jurisdictions and our work promoting water quality, I think we're building awareness and desire in the community to take care of some of these water quality issues.
Well, and in many cases, the water quality issues sort of go hand in hand with flood mitigation. Those projects sort of achieve two things. And that's something obviously folks in Dubuque are concerned about. You, not just from the Mississippi, but you've had some flash flooding events over the years, I think.
Correct. Yeah, and I think the benefits of working throughout, across jurisdictional boundaries. I mean, some of these certain outcomes may be more important to different entities. I know the county is very concerned about flooding and floodwater management. The city of Dubuque is concerned about pollutants, environmental pollutants, and then we also have a requirement to meet the nutrient reductions in our permit. So, as you said, how can we work with these other entities to combine funding, work together on reducing nutrients, but also reducing flooding, reducing sediment loss, building habitat, recreational opportunities.
Chris, when you mentioned the livestock industry and the issue of it being sort of crammed into these watersheds, there's been talk of doing some sort of moratorium on new construction. That hasn't had much traction at the State House. There's been some county supervisors, even in some counties in rural Iowa, that have called on the legislature to redo the scoring matrix that they use to, ostensibly when it was passed, that was going to give counties a little more local control. I don't think that's really panned out. But, reforming that system, are those good approaches, or is there something else? I mean, how do you get at that?
So as you said, I think there's some on the ag side even that maybe think that the system that we have, the master matrix system, needs to be revisited. I would say without a doubt it does need to be. There's some real fundamental things about the master matrix that are not environmentally sound. One are the formulas used in the manure management plans that enable farmers to apply nutrient, at amounts that are, far larger than what Iowa State would recommend in their nutrient calculators. And so we need, as I said, the real weakness in the master matrix is it provides us no capacity to manage nutrients at the watershed scale. We have none. And so we know the counties are basically powerless to deny these permits, even when there's a large consensus. A lot of the opposition to them has been, air and the odors. Yeah, I mean, I think it's undeniable that you know, a county or a watershed just has an unlimited capacity to support livestock. It just doesn't. And so, yes, I do think the legislature needs to revisit the master matrix for sure.
Yeah, I mean, it's nearly 20 years old. And, you know, the normal complaints about it are that you only have to get a 50% grade to pass. You don't have to, I mean, you don't have to pass a lot of categories to clear the matrix, and environmental ones, you can skirt some of them. And also you've got the situation where, you know, the permitting, with the permitting, you know, the number of hogs that require a permit, lots of facilities are being built below that permit threshold.
Yeah, I mean, that's the problem with regulation. I mean, farmers
Yeah.
find a way around it. You know, we have a 2,500 hog limit, and they need an NPDES permit. And, you know, so that's why we have, you know, hundreds, if not thousands of confinements that have 2,497 hogs, you know, or they'll split them up into multiple facilities that are not far away from each other to get under the permitting requirements. And so, again, like I said, if we had the ability to manage nutrients at the watershed scale, those things would cease being problems.
I've got a question here, and anyone can take it, or maybe no one can take it. I don't know. Do farmers care about the water quality of their family's well drinking water? And if farmers take floodplain land out of crop production, is there a way to assure them that they will not take a financial loss? So I guess there's a couple questions there. There are, I mean, private wells are an issue with water quality. They're not regulated. People can have them tested, but it's voluntary. I don't know how much, if you've done work on that, Chris, looking at the problem with wells.
Well, we manage the well water database here at the University of Iowa. Professor Dave Swertney is the head of that program. And, you know, the truth of the matter is, you know, a lot of these wells have been abandoned for the purposes of drinking water. And so we have rural water systems that cover most of the state. And, you know, from my perspective, if you live on a farmstead, it's a good idea to hook up to rural water, because almost all of these wells, at least they're, say, less than 50 feet deep, are contaminated. You know, people should not be drinking that water, especially if it hasn't been tested. And so most of these areas have access to rural water. And so, yes, the groundwater is an issue. I mean, you know, taken in whole, it's probably at least as big an issue as Des Moines Waterworks is. And so, you know, we have both farmstead wells and small towns municipal systems that rely on wells that are very vulnerable to nitrate and bacteria. City of Manchester's one. They have nitrate removal, and I think I heard here in the last week or so, there's another huge confinement wanting to go in near the town. And so it's a problem. We've known that the jury's been out on the groundwater here in Iowa for a long time.
Tom, if I could chime in.
Sure.
I know hundreds of farmers and many, the vast majority I know are deeply concerned about management of water quality as well. The problem is we're stuck in a system that we're not sure how to get out of. And a lot of the problem has been the drainage, but farmers are deeply concerned about that. And as I talk to many farmers, I know some very conscientious farmers that do cover crops, no-till, everything. And I brought up to them one time, one man I'm thinking of in particular, well, what do you think if we just regulated this? And he said, boy, that's the last thing we need. So I think there's still, it'll even be hard to get a consensus among farmers that are doing the right thing to have mandates, let alone the general farming public in general. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's the second part of this question. I would assume if we ever got legislation to, take those floodplains, the 2-year floodplain out of production, I assume there would be some sort of compensation. I mean, there usually is in programs that take land out of production. I mean, back in the day, we used to have the 10% set aside, and some of these other programs, conservation reserve, I would assume that there would be financial compensation. But I mean, we're sort of a long ways from looking at what a bill would do.
I mean,
yeah.
If I could chime in here a little bit.
Sure.
The volunteer thing, look, it's great if we can. We know for a certainty that some farmers can reduce the nutrient loss from their fields when they, install all these practices, they do everything. There's examples of that across Iowa. But, that stuff is paid for with public money for the most part. And so how do we do that when we have, crops on 26 million acres? Where are you going to get the money? The other thing with the volunteer thing, the farmer says, well, that's the last thing we need. Well, you just cannot expect farmers, or you cannot expect the taxpayer to continue funding these practices on these farms and give farmers a license to do whatever they want with their inputs. That is not a sustainable policy. It just isn't. You can't do it forever. Eventually, the taxpayer is going to wake up that he's subsidizing his own pollution. Okay. And so, we indemnify these farmers with crop insurance and all these other programs that we've seen over the last 3 or 4 years, the trade mitigation payments, billions and billions of dollars. And, great, but, we've let the industry have its cake and eat it too, right? So we pay for the pollution, the taxpayer pays for the pollution at the same time that we indemnify and subsidize the production. Again, I would just emphasize this is not sustainable policy for the long run. And
Scott, did you have anything to add to that? You have 2 minutes for rebuttal. I feel like we're at a presidential debate all of a sudden.
No, I don't even wish to debate. I understand where Chris is coming from. What I'm just trying to say is there still is opportunity. We can say, well, we got to wait for legislation. Let's don't do anything. But really, there's tremendous opportunities, and we have to be more creative in how we reach farmers. And, you talk to the average farmer, they don't read anything. They just watch YouTube. And so, we have to be creative and through social media and in ways that we can reach it. I noticed WHO is having water quality weeks, and those are good ideas and good ways to reach farmers. And we have to come up with more creative ways. And maybe instead of investing money on research, we need to get a sociologist involved and more sociologists involved in how we can change behaviors.
Scott, do you think it should be open-ended though? I mean, what if we said, you've got 10 years to adopt these practices, and after the 10 years, then there's going to be some, at least a requirement of sort of minimum standards of care that you need to adhere to for water quality. You think that would be more acceptable to farmers if you gave them a ramp into the future?
Yeah, it sounds like a good idea. I'd have to study it some more before I really got behind it, but it sounds logical to me.
Because it seems like one of the...
the purpose of legislation is just to, it's like speed limits, some people follow them, some don't, but it gives you kind of a gauge of where you need to be at. And so if you have some regulation that kind of gives you a gauge of where you need to be at, then I think that's helpful. So wise legislation can help us define the road ditches to where farmers need to be.
Yeah, well,
but without the consensus of the governed, we're not going to get anywhere. So
yeah, it seems like one of the problems underlying all of this is that folks are adopting practices, but the pace is slow and the scope is still small, and so it's you've got the Environmental Council and other groups sort of calculating it'll be, hundreds of years until you have this many acres and cover crops that you would need to reduce nitrates by the percentages that the nutrient reduction strategy calls for. What do you think, Chris? You think, sort of a hybrid approach where you leave it voluntary for a while and then set sort of a benchmark that they need to meet before regulation pops in?
Well, I think we all know if you put some, milestone out there 10 years out, they're going to continue doing what they're doing now for 9 years. Yeah. And then at the end, at the 10th year, it'll be a mad rush. And, I would just say, we've got a continental scale problem here. Okay. This is not a problem unique to Iowa. It might be as bad or maybe worse here than most other places, but it's not unique to us. And so we have to really think about it at that scale. And so the Farm Bill programs are very critical. How the federal Farm Bill is crafted is very critical, to what happens here in Iowa in the context of water quality. And I would just say, think about the scale of the problem, continental scale problem. Try to find a problem like that has been solved through individual actions. You cannot. There are no examples of problems of this scale that have been solved through individual actions. And so it's not that the individual actions are bad. I'm not saying that at all. But to think that we're going to solve this in any reasonable amount of time by, pinching off one farm at a time is, it's a fantasy. I mean, let's face it. If we're going to solve this, we need some coordinated large-scale response. It's probably got to come from the federal government.
Here's one question I think, Chris, you've talked about this in the past. What about bioreactors for filtering out the nutrients from tile systems?
So here again, I mean, bioreactors are good, right? I published a paper on a bioreactor, but on average, they treat 40 acres, right? And so they cost, maybe $15,000. And so you just start doing the math on these things. Is it a landscape scale solution? No, it isn't. We do not have enough trees in Iowa to make the wood chips that are necessary to produce all the bioreactors that we have. We would have to, be hauling in timber from northern Minnesota to make all these bioreactors. And so any of the edge of field stuff, it works. We know that it works. There's no doubt about that. But the question is, where do you get the money to implement this at the landscape scale? And, this is a problem that's got to compete with everything else, schools, roads, you name it.
Right.
Just, it's not going to happen.
Maybe we should have made bioreactors out of all the derecho trees that are piled up in Cedar Rapids.
I know that question has come up. But let me tell you, the problem isn't right now the lack of wood chips. It's the lack of farmers that want bioreactors.
Sure.
We're not wood chip limited right now.
Yeah. So William, I've kind of I've let you be quiet. Do you have thoughts on any of this that's transpired?
I think we're seeing some success through our collaboration with the Catfish Creek Watershed Management Authority in reaching out to landowners. Definitely hasn't been easy, but I think we're building relationships over time. And then these farmers, I think, are starting to see the benefits. Looking forward to seeing the evolution of our programs here and how we can collaborate better with those farmers. I mentioned we've got a cover crop program where we'll pay, I can't think off the top of my head how much it is per acre. I think it might be around $40 that we'll grant them. Soil quality restoration that's I would say more on an urban setting. Trying to think some of the other big projects coming up. I think Swiss Valley Nature Preserve. There's going to be a stream bank restoration or corridor improvement project. I mean, I think we're building some momentum here, and I think we're heading in the right direction. But it definitely takes landowner buy-in for that. You know, especially if you're taking crop ground out of production, what does that going to mean for their bottom line? We recently collaborated with Iowa corn growers on a field day down near Cascade, where a farmer has gone from 30-inch rows of crops to double rows spaced 60 inches apart with cover crops in between there, using those cover crops to fix nitrogen, and then over time reducing the amount of fertilizer inputs needed on those fields. So I think there are definitely farmers out there that are willing to try different ways, but I also believe there's a long way to go on that.
Mm-hmm. So we're winding down. Scott, do you have any thoughts you want to get in before the bell?
The last thing is, we haven't talked about it, and it's worth a session on its own, but absentee landowners could be a huge ally for us, or they can get in the way pretty drastically. And to the extent that we can reach absentee landowners to take a stake in the water quality coming off the land they own, I mean, that would be huge if we could somehow either through tax structure or somehow incentivize them to work with their people farming their land to implement best practices. That would be huge.
Yeah, that's a great point. What is it? 60% of the land in Iowa is absentee owned. Is that something along those lines? It's
something like that. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Chris, do you have some thoughts at the end?
Every discussion of this, includes that word incentivize. And so, basically what we're saying is, do we have the resources to pay farmers to not pollute? And I'm saying we don't. We don't. And so none of this comes free. You don't just magically get good water quality because you want it. I mean, there's got to be investments of money and time, and we know about some things that work. The question is, who pays to, get that stuff done, and then how do you get the farmers to adopt that even when you're willing to pay? And, I don't have that answer. What we have done has not worked. I mean, it's abundantly clear. The taxpayer has paid for billions and billions of dollars of conservation that has not solved this nutrient problem. And so, we need some transformational things to happen here if we're going to solve this.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, that's some of the pushback on raising the sales tax to fill the Natural Resources Outdoor Recreation Trust Fund. I mean, there's been a push against it from the right because it requires a tax increase. But from the other side of the spectrum, people are like, why should we pay for measures to reduce pollution that we aren't responsible for? So, I mean, that's the debate, and we'll have it again, in January if the legislature can come back. The pandemic will still be going on, unfortunately. Yeah. It looks like. So, well, okay. Well, we got to the hour. It went fast. I want to, thank all of you for joining us and talking about this. And unfortunately, it'll probably be the subject of a panel next year because, as Chris suggests, and others have suggested, it's a huge problem that doesn't have an easy solution, and the politics is difficult. So, okay.
All right. I want to thank everyone for joining. Hope you enjoyed it. Go ahead and grab some lunch. There's a Q&A with Governor Kim Reynolds next at 12:30, and then keynote speaker Ronald F. Ferguson is at 1:15. So everyone have a good afternoon.